I grew up in Aurora, Colorado, and my parents always had a knack for worrying. They claimed I wasn't ready to live on my own. They'd rattle off little concerns. You'll forget to lock the door, or you'll open the door to a stranger and get robbed. Maybe it was their own experiences talking, or maybe they just couldn't picture me as an independent adult. Either way, it drove me crazy. I wanted to prove them wrong more than anything. So, when I turned 20 in June of 2023, I jumped at the chance to move out. I found a little studio apartment not too far from Aurora Community College, where I take classes part-time. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I loved it. It had a creaky front door, beige walls, and a cramped kitchenette, but there was a certain magic in calling it my own space. Finally, I felt like I was doing something on my own terms. For the first couple of weeks, things were normal. I bought cheap furniture off Craigslist and IKEA, decorated the walls with posters, and tried my best to make it feel cozy. My old TV was this small, boxy thing that had been with me for a decade. It was outdated, with fuzzy speakers and a flickering screen. I decided to sell it on Craigslist and use the money to buy a bigger TV, one with better woofers that wouldn't crackle every time the bass kicked in. I listed it for a pretty reasonable price, just $75. Within a couple of hours, I got a handful of messages. Most people offered around the same price I'd asked. But then one message really stood out. A guy named Henry offered to pay $100, no negotiation. It was weird. In the listing, I had clearly stated I was willing to negotiate a little, but he didn't even try, just said he was very interested and would pay extra to pick it up right away. My parents' warnings about opening the door to strangers lingered in the back of my mind. I mean, who offers way more than the asking price on Craigslist without reason? My first instinct was to ask my friend Layla if she'd come over and hang out while Henry stopped by. Strength in numbers, right? But then I thought about how badly I wanted to show everyone that I could do this alone. I convinced myself not to rely on anyone. After all, broad daylight with a guy who just wants to buy a TV, how bad could it be? Henry and I agreed on a time, 11 a.m. the following Thursday. Thursday morning came. I tidied up the apartment, placing the TV neatly by the door so we could move it easily. I texted Henry around 10:30 a.m. just to confirm. No response. I waited another hour and nothing. Eventually, I gave up and went about my day, annoyed that I'd stayed in for nothing. Days passed with no word. I wondered if I should just sell the TV to someone else, but I got busy with classes and midterm projects. Then one Sunday night, I remember it clearly because it was June 25th. I was about to crawl into bed when my doorbell rang. It was nearly midnight, which set me on edge immediately. People rarely visit me, let alone at that hour. My phone buzzed a second later, a text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Henry. I'm at your door. Sorry, it's late." My heart skipped a beat. I walked quietly to the door and peered through the peephole. There were 3 men standing there. I recognized Henry's face from the tiny profile picture he had sent me. Though it was too dim to see him clearly, I had the sense it was him. The other 2 guys looked bigger. Everything in my gut screamed that this was wrong. I quickly texted back. "Too late to do this now. Can we do it in the morning?" "Okay," he answered. "I'm so sorry. I'll come by tomorrow at 9 a.m. I could hear them mumbling outside, but thankfully, after a few tense seconds, they shuffled away. I waited a few minutes before even stepping away from the door. My knees felt shaky, and I realized I'd been gripping my phone too hard. The weirdness was undeniable. Why show up at midnight, unannounced, with 2 other guys in tow? But at least they were gone, so I tried to push the anxiety out of my mind. I brushed my teeth, turned off the lights, and tried to settle down. Around 2 a.m., just as I was drifting off, I heard this loud, violent pounding on the door, almost like someone was throwing their body against it. my stomach dropped. Every hair on my neck stood on end. I froze in bed, waiting, hoping it would stop. It didn't. The pounding got louder, and suddenly, I heard a crack, like wood splitting. I realized they were trying to force the door open. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding, and tiptoed toward the front door. As I neared it, a section of the door frame gave way, and the door burst open so abruptly that I stumbled backward. In the dim light from the hallway, I could see Henry leading the way, his face twisted in this urgent, almost panicked expression. Behind him were the two men from earlier. They were bigger than I remembered, at least in that moment when fear was exploding in my chest. I let out a panicked yelp and spun around, sprinting toward my bedroom. I slammed that door, locked it, then rushed straight into the bathroom and locked that door too. 2 layers of protection, for whatever it was worth. My hands were shaking so bad that it took me 3 tries to dial 911. The operator's calm, practiced voice was the only anchor I had. I managed to whisper that there was a break-in happening right now, and I gave her my address. The men were in the apartment. I could hear them moving around. One of them shouted something to another, and I swear I heard them kicking through my bedroom door. Or maybe the hallway closet, honestly. Everything was jumbled in my ears. Within minutes, though it felt like an eternity, I heard sirens. Then I heard yelling from outside. A few loud orders like, "Get down!" There was a surge of footsteps in the hall. I crept out of the bathroom after a moment of quiet and found police officers in my living room. One of them came over and guided me outside to safety. The front door was ruined, hanging crookedly off its frame, and I could see some of my belongings. Later that night, the police told me they had caught Henry and the 2 men just as they were trying to get away with a bag of my stuff, laptop, video games, even a few pieces of cheap jewelry. They found my TV by the doorway with wires dangling, half wrapped in an old blanket I'd left out. It was so surreal to see my entire life scattered and rummaged through. In the hours that followed, an officer explained that Henry and his 2 accomplices had been flagged before for suspicious Craigslist meetups, though they'd never been caught in the act. Apparently, their method was to lure people, especially women, by offering more money than the listing price. Once they knew the person would be home alone, they'd pick a time to show up unexpectedly. If they didn't manage a smooth entry, they'd resort to breaking in. They'd been doing this for a while, targeting people around Denver and Aurora. Hearing that made me realize how naive I'd been. I was so determined to stand on my own 2 feet that I ignored the obvious red flags. I just really wanted to prove to my parents and myself that I was an independent adult. I remember the police officer looking almost sorry for me. He handed me back a pair of earrings that Henry's group had dropped on the sidewalk. "You got lucky," he said gently. "We showed up at just the right time." I nodded, still in shock. My legs felt like jelly, and my mind was racing with half-formed thoughts. What if I'd opened the door at midnight? What if I hadn't been able to call 911 in time? The rest of the night was a blur, giving my statement, filling out forms, and listening to the apartment landlord rant about the damaged door. By the time everything settled, it was nearly sunrise. I sat in the living room, staring at the place where my door used to latch properly, and I realized that all my parents' warnings suddenly felt justified. I'd always found it annoying that my parents doubted me, but as I replayed that night over and over in my head, I could practically hear my mom's voice. "You can't be too careful." She was right. Maybe they just knew the world better than I did. Maybe I needed that lesson. That creeping sense of vulnerability never quite left me. Sometimes late at night, I'll hear normal creaks and pops in my apartment walls and wonder if someone's out there, testing the locks again. It's not paranoia, it's the knowledge that there really are people like Henry and his friends searching for easy targets. That's the part that sticks with me the most, even though Henry had come across as so friendly and casual over text. He had a regular, plain name. He used polite words. He never threatened me directly until he burst through my door. The terrifying thing is that you never truly know who's behind those messages. And worse, I almost invited them in because I wanted to prove something. Before we dive into the next story, if you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. I always wanted to be a quarterback. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, my dream was to throw winning passes under Friday night lights. But my dad, a retired Army captain, believed in discipline above all else. He saw potential in me, just not on the football field. By the time I was 18, I found myself enrolling in the local police academy instead of trying out for a college team. I guess you could say I traded one uniform for another. I won't pretend I don't sometimes look back and wonder what could have been. But after a while, I got comfortable in law enforcement. I liked the structure, the sense of purpose. My dad and I butted heads a lot, but he was proud to see me wearing the badge. I ended up working my way into a detective position with the Phoenix Police Department, focusing mainly on organized crime. In May of 2007, I made an arrest that put me on the front pages of local news. I pulled over a white Chevy Suburban at 2 a.m. for suspicious driving near the outskirts of Maricopa County. Turned out the driver was a man named Ronnie "Red" Alvarez, the rumored leader of a violent burglary ring that had been terrorizing local neighborhoods. A tip from an informant had me on edge that night, so I decided to follow my gut and stop the Suburban when I spotted it idling without headlights. It was a routine traffic stop that escalated fast, but I managed to cuff him alone. Felt like a huge victory, like intercepting a game-winning pass in the last seconds of a championship. Shortly after that arrest, things got strange. My wife Ava and I have a 9-year-old son named Connor. One afternoon, just a week after Alvarez's arraignment, Connor didn't come home from school. At first I assumed he stayed late for soccer practice. When the school office told me they hadn't seen him leave, my stomach twisted. I rushed over, combed every hallway, and checked in with the few teachers who remained. He was nowhere. I put out an alert, enlisted the help of colleagues, and started a citywide search. The department worked around the clock. We put up bulletins, checked security cams, and roped in the FBI's local field office. Days slipped by with no word or sign of Connor. I'd never known a terror like that. My chest felt constantly hollow, and I barely slept. Each hour that passed without finding him chipped away at me. On the 6th day of the search, we got a tip that Alvarez's gang might have orchestrated the kidnapping in retaliation for his arrest. They had connections all over the state. I charged forward with everything I had, pressing old informants, following every lead, running on pure adrenaline. But every path seemed to dead end. No sightings, no calls, no ransom demands. It was like my son vanished. The nights were the worst. Lying awake at 3 a.m., watching the ceiling fan circle, I'd blame myself for what happened. Alvarez was behind bars, but maybe his crew wanted to teach me a lesson. That kind of guilt sinks in deep, like a stone in your chest. Ava tried to be supportive, but we both felt utterly helpless. Then, 10 days after Connor disappeared, I was in my bedroom, going through some old case files to see if I'd missed anything. Ava was staying with her sister for a night. She needed a break from the tension. Around midnight, I heard a soft thump from somewhere below. My heart rate kicked up, but I tried to stay rational. The house creaks sometimes, and I was keyed up. Another sound followed, louder, definitely coming from the basement. The door to the basement is in the hallway near the kitchen. I hadn't used it for days, so I figured maybe a pipe burst or some boxes fell. Grabbing my flashlight, I headed down quietly, one step at a time, trying not to let my imagination run wild. I reached the bottom and flicked on the overhead light. At first, everything looked normal, just shelves of old photo albums, holiday decorations, and a few bins. Then I heard a muffled whimper coming from behind a row of boxes. My throat went dry. I inched closer, stepping around a half-broken coffee table we'd meant to toss out. There, in the far corner, was Connor. He was tied up, his wrists and ankles bound with rough rope, an old cloth gag around his mouth. His eyes locked onto mine, wide with fear and relief. I nearly dropped to my knees. The terror, the relief, the confusion, it all slammed into me at once. I managed to steady my hands long enough to untie him and remove the gag. He clung to me, shaking so hard I could feel his heartbeat against my chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy and faint. He said he'd been picked up from school by our housemaid, Jackson, but Connor had always known Jackson as a friendly presence around the house. We'd hired him months ago through a domestic services agency because Ava and I both worked long hours. Connor didn't suspect anything was off until Jackson drove him somewhere unfamiliar and locked him in a dark place. Connor didn't know where he was taken, but he remembered hearing them mention me, something about getting even. I ran upstairs, gun drawn, checking every room. No sign of Jackson. I called the station, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. Within minutes, units were surrounding my house, scouring the property. No one found a trace of him. It was like he vanished into thin air. Over the next few days, we discovered that Jackson had never really been employed by any agency. His paperwork was all fake. He'd wormed his way into our home specifically to get close to my family. And his real name wasn't even Jackson. He was an ex-con with known ties to Alvarez's gang. The deeper we dug, the more horrifying it became. This had all been orchestrated from the start. It took almost 2 weeks of tireless searching to finally track Jackson down. A local hiker reported suspicious activity in the Tonto National Forest. Someone sneaking around an abandoned hunting cabin off a trail that wasn't on any official map. My partner and I led a small team out there at dawn. The place was half collapsed, with rotting roof shingles, broken windows. We approached in silence, weapons drawn. Everything felt tense, like the moment before a big play in a football game, except here the stakes were life or death. We found Jackson alone, rummaging through boxes of stolen goods. He scrambled for a weapon, but we moved in fast. Once he was cuffed, I finally had the chance to meet his gaze. He wouldn't say a word, not even a plea. His calm stare was more unsettling than if he had screamed. Standing there in that dimly lit cabin, I realized I was looking at someone who had deliberately infiltrated my life to tear it apart. At the station, Jackson refused to cooperate. He denied everything. As for Alvarez, he kept his mouth shut behind bars. Eventually, the case got tangled up in a bigger investigation into the entire gang. I had my son back, thank God, but the damage was done. Connor was terrified to be alone in any room. Ava and I put the house up for sale. Neither of us could stand to stay there. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. Sometimes, late at night, I remember how it all started with that traffic stop. Nabbing Alvarez felt like a win, but it came at a crushing cost. The group used my own home as a pawn in their twisted game, and the question that still haunts me is, how many more people were involved? People I might have trusted, people I saw every day, before I realized they were part of this same network? It's that question, unanswered and echoing in my thoughts, that keeps me awake. Even now, whenever a floorboard settles or my phone buzzes unexpectedly, I get a jolt of adrenaline. Because I know there could still be others out there, waiting, planning their next move. Maybe they're just faceless criminals in a file, or maybe they're blending into everyday life, like Jackson did, waiting for the right moment to strike. I keep thinking about how easily he got close to my family, how carefully he played the part of a helpful, unassuming maid. If something like that could happen once, couldn't it happen again? And if I, a trained detective, got duped in my own home, what does that mean for everyone else? That's the part that leaves me unsettled. I used to work the night shift at a small warehouse just outside Sacramento, California. It was April of 2022 when I first started. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., which honestly wasn't too bad. The place was quiet at night, peaceful even, mostly just me and a couple of others handling orders, packing boxes, and sorting inventory. My boss, Mike Evans, was the kind of guy you'd instantly trust. He had a fatherly vibe about him. Late 40s, glasses, always neatly dressed in a button-up and jeans. On my first night, he shook my hand firmly, smiled warmly, and made sure I knew my way around the place. Mike would regularly check in, bring us coffee or snacks, and always asked how we were doing, like genuinely asked. I liked Mike. Everyone did. Things went smoothly for months. I settled into a comfortable routine, clock in, grab coffee, handle packages, and chat occasionally with coworkers. Mike usually stuck around until midnight, making sure everything ran smoothly before heading home. Life was predictable, easygoing, and safe, or at least that's what I believed. By mid-August, something started feeling off. Mike began lingering longer into the night. At first, he just stayed until 1 or 2 a.m., quietly working in his office with the blinds shut tight. It was strange, but we assumed he was busy with paperwork or something. But the longer he stayed, the more withdrawn he became. His easy smile faded, replaced by tense expressions and occasional irritated sighs. One night in September, around 3 a.m., I stepped out back for some fresh air. It was chilly and quiet. That's when I noticed Mike's truck parked way off near the far edge of our lot, partially hidden behind dumpsters. He usually parked near the entrance. I stood there puzzled, my breath visible in the crisp air. I could see Mike inside his truck, arguing on the phone. He was angry, gesturing harshly with one hand, his face twisted with a hostility I'd never seen. I quietly slipped back inside, unsure what I had just witnessed. I figured maybe he was dealing with personal issues. Who doesn't have bad nights, right? But from that point on, things only got stranger. Mike's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd show up later, sometimes past midnight, disappearing into his office immediately. He grew short-tempered, snapping at people for minor mistakes. The guy who once brought us donuts now barely even made eye contact. Rumors among coworkers surfaced. Whispers about shady visitors coming in at odd hours when most staff had already left. One coworker, Alex, swore he saw Mike handing over sealed boxes to unfamiliar people in unmarked vans around 4 a.m. It sounded sketchy, but Mike? He seemed like the last guy capable of something like that. I brushed off those stories, blaming sleep deprivation and boredom for causing paranoia. But I couldn't completely ignore that nagging voice in the back of my mind, reminding me about Mike's strange late-night calls and hidden truck meetings. Then came the night in October, just before Halloween, when I stayed late to help finish a backlog of orders. It was around 4:30 a.m., the warehouse silent and empty except for me, or at least I thought. As I moved some boxes toward the loading bay, I heard muffled voices echoing from Mike's office. His door was cracked slightly open. I stepped closer, barely breathing, my pulse quickening as I peered through the narrow opening. Mike was standing by his desk with two rough-looking men I'd never seen before. The men were hunched over, examining something on Mike's desk. Cash, a lot of cash. Mike's expression was cold, focused, nothing like the friendly boss I thought I knew. My heart dropped, adrenaline surging. As quietly as I could, I backed away and returned to my workstation, pretending to pack boxes while trying to calm my nerves. Within minutes, the two men left through the back entrance, glancing briefly in my direction as they passed. Mike never came out of his office that night, and I avoided looking his way as I left at 6 a.m. The next shift, Mike was back to normal. Friendly greetings, casual smiles, handing out coffee like always. It was disorienting, seeing him flip back so easily. For days I convinced myself I'd misread the situation, but the image of him counting stacks of cash at night, surrounded by suspicious strangers, wouldn't leave my mind. Not long after, Alex quit suddenly, offering no reason other than needing a change. He barely said goodbye. That felt off too, like maybe he knew something more. Then one night in November, around 3:45 a.m., I was alone in the warehouse, finishing up inventory logs. Mike hadn't been in that night, which wasn't unusual anymore. As I marked off a shipment, the loading dock door suddenly creaked open. My heart froze. No deliveries were scheduled at this hour. Slow footsteps echoed through the warehouse, heavy and deliberate. I hid behind a shelf, gripping a box cutter tightly. The footsteps paused near Mike's office, followed by the faint jingling of keys. I peeked cautiously around the shelf. It was Mike. He looked disheveled, hair messy, clothes rumpled. He unlocked his office and vanished inside, leaving the door ajar. Seconds later, loud bangs came from his office. Drawers slammed open, files scattered onto the floor. He was searching frantically for something. I felt nauseous, terrified he'd realized someone was still in the building. Finally, he rushed out, holding a thick envelope tightly against his chest, glancing around nervously before hurrying outside to his truck. He never came back after that night. No one heard from him again. His phone went straight to voicemail. Rumors circled fast. Some said he'd fled to Mexico. Others whispered darker fates. Eventually, police visited the warehouse, questioning employees about stolen shipments and Mike's suspicious activities. None of us knew much. But apparently, Mike had been involved with some dangerous people, using the warehouse as a hub for stolen goods. Months passed. I eventually quit that job too, unable to shake the feeling that someone could walk through those doors at any moment, looking for Mike or for something he owed them. Even after a long time, whenever I'm alone at night, I think back to Mike. The friendly smile, the thoughtful conversations, all masking something dark and dangerous beneath the surface. What terrifies me most isn't what I witnessed, but what I never fully understood. Mike had two faces, and I only saw the good one clearly. The other side, the one tangled up with criminals and late-night deals, was just a shadow, hidden beneath the friendly exterior. The chilling thought still lingers. How well do we ever really know the people we trust? I'm writing this in January of 2021, a little over a year after it happened, and every time I think about it, I feel that same uneasy knot in my stomach. My name is Darren, and I used to live just outside Syracuse, New York. I was finishing up my senior year of college back then, working part-time at a local grocery store. In late November 2019, my friend Mitch sent me a link to an online forum post about an abandoned building near downtown. Supposedly, it used to be an old textile warehouse that went bankrupt decades ago. The post mentioned strange noises coming from inside at night. Some folks blamed rats or stray dogs, others hinted at squatters. I've always been drawn to old, forgotten places. The quiet emptiness fascinates me. It's like a puzzle, trying to figure out what happened there and why it was left behind. Mitch and I made plans to check it out on a Friday night. We didn't exactly advertise our plan because we knew it was a terrible idea, but we convinced ourselves we'd just go in, look around, and leave quickly. That evening, we parked about a block away on a deserted side street. The weather was cold enough to see our breath in the air, and the sky was a dull gray. The building itself was massive, 5 stories tall, with broken windows and graffiti all over its brick facade. There was a padlocked chain on the front doors, but we found a gap in a side window that had been busted out. Inside, the place smelled like mildew and stale air. Our flashlights cut through dust particles floating in the darkness. Pieces of drywall were scattered on the floor, and rusted machinery stood in the corners, silent and forgotten. We spoke in hushed tones, more out of instinct than anything else. It felt weird to talk normally in that place, as though the walls were listening. We started poking around the first floor, stepping carefully to avoid random holes in the concrete. There were old offices with collapsed ceilings, yellowed paperwork strewn about, and broken desks. I found a ledger dated 1978 detailing shipments of fabrics. Reading those notes made the place feel more real. People had come here daily, typed away at these desks, and then one day, it all just stopped. Mitch and I decided to explore the upper floors. We located a creaky metal staircase near the back. Each step groaned under our weight, and the echo felt unnaturally loud. On the second floor, we stumbled across a large open area with rows of overturned sewing tables. The windows were shattered, letting in a constant draft. Sheets of plastic flapped from the rafters like some kind of eerie decoration. I remember thinking how the place felt stuck in time, like a scene from a forgotten decade. Part of me wanted to leave right then, but something about the emptiness pulled me in deeper. We found a partially open elevator shaft, but the elevator itself wasn't there, just a dark pit leading straight down. Mitch threw a small chunk of debris in there, and we both counted several seconds before hearing it hit the bottom. We made a note to avoid that area. Up on the third floor, things got unsettling. We noticed footprints in the thick dust, like somebody had walked through recently. It was hard to tell how fresh they were, but they weren't ours, and the pattern led toward a hallway that branched off to the right. We followed them, our flashlights trembling just a little. We weren't sure what we expected to find, maybe other explorers, or possibly someone living there. I wasn't scared yet, just on edge. As we rounded the corner, we saw a door at the end of the corridor. Something metallic glinted beneath the sliver of light from outside. Mitch and I paused. Neither of us said anything. The footprints disappeared abruptly, almost like whoever made them had stepped off into a side room, but there was no door or gap in the wall for them to vanish into. I felt my pulse picking up. It was too quiet, except for the faint drip of water leaking somewhere behind us. Mitch tapped my shoulder and pointed down at the floor. There was a discarded flashlight lying there, as if someone had dropped it. I knelt and picked it up. The thing still had a battery left because I could see a weak flicker when I pressed the switch. At that moment, a dull scraping sound came from further down the hall, near the door. It reminded me of someone dragging something heavy across the concrete. We both froze. Mitch gestured for me to turn off my flashlight, so I did. We stood in darkness for a few seconds, listening. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate. I leaned forward, trying to peer through the gloom. My eyes adjusted enough to see that the door was slightly open. There wasn't any light coming from inside the room, just blackness. A part of me wanted to call out, but something about that sound told me to stay quiet. Then it stopped. Dead silence again. Mitch silently motioned that we should go back. Normally, I might have insisted on seeing what was in there, but my gut told me it was a bad idea. We retreated down the hallway as quietly as we could, moving faster than before. By the time we reached the staircase, my hands were shaking. We scrambled down to the first floor, nearly slipping on broken pieces of drywall. Once we were outside, we jogged to the car without saying a word. Only when we were safely locked in, I asked Mitch if he saw anybody in that doorway. He just shook his head. I turned the ignition and we drove off. We didn't talk much on the way home, and we never went back. I tried to rationalize it later. Maybe it was a homeless person, or someone scavenging metal, dragging a pipe, or something like that. But what throws me off is how those footprints just disappeared. It's possible they faded out, or that we missed them in the dark. Still, it felt unnatural. And that flashlight on the floor, why leave it behind if it still worked? Unless something forced them to drop it.